So welcome everyone. Let me just say again, we're welcoming you to today's presentation, which we're going to call Budgeting 101 for Library Literacy Programs. And I want to make a few comments before we start. The presenters today are our friend Sherilyn Hunt from the Literacy Initiatives Project, and me, Bev Schwartzberg, and my colleague Allison Giuffredo from the State Library. And we want to acknowledge a couple things before we start. One is, we know you guys are lovers of adult literacy and family literacy and ESL programs, and you probably didn't take this job because you love spreadsheets. You probably didn't take this job because you love numbers. Nonetheless, here we are, and it is a part of your job. The second thing I want to acknowledge is that it's actually relatively unusual for library employees to have the degree of interest and control over a budget that literacy coordinators do. Many of you have worked other jobs in the library, and you probably haven't had to worry about budgets. But library literacy coordinators often do worry about budgets because you do hold some responsibility, and you certainly hold reporting responsibility. And that's really quite unusual unless somebody's working on a grant-funded project in the library, or at least they're at a certain administrative level. They typically don't work with budgets as much as you guys do. And so we want to provide the support that you need. So we acknowledge that usually people don't get into literacy because they love numbers, but you guys have a need to handle numbers. We also want to say a third thing, and this is that today's presentation is just an introduction, and we hope to do more along these lines. We want to introduce you to certain terminology and certain practices that we think are really helpful in the budgeting process. So it's just an introduction, and we're going to cover some technical stuff, but it's stuff that we think that you need to know. And we also recognize that all of you work in different places, and not every local government, whether it be city, county, or your independent district, handles finances in exactly the same way. And we recognize also that some of you may work for nonprofit agencies that contract with the library to provide California library literacy services. So there are lots of different ways that people approach budgets. What we're giving you today is sort of a general overview, but it's also something that we think will be helpful for everyone. And with that said, let's get going and go to the next slide. And Allison.
All right, so by the end of Budgeting 101 for literacy programs today, CLLS program administrators like you all will understand the fundamental components of budgeting and be able to apply these components to your CLLS program budget. And let me gear up this poll. We'd like to check in on what you'd like to learn about budgeting. So I'm going to launch this now. And you should see quite a few options. There's only one question. What are the main topics you want to learn about in today's session? But you may have to scroll down to see all of the options, and you can select all that apply. Oh, great. I'm seeing that the overwhelming favorite here is tracking your budget. And what seems to be tied is budget terminology, understanding your agency's financial reports and documents, and salary and benefits projections tracking, and writing budget narratives, along with allowable and unallowable expenses. So we have some pretty good interest across the spectrum of responses, but overall tracking your budget seems to be the favorite so far.
So we can share out the results, but while we're waiting, I just want to say, if you have your camera on, you probably want to turn it off. I don't think there's a need to be captured in the recording unless you really want to be. So thank you. Okay, you want to end the poll and share the results, Allison?
Yes, I'll just wait about 8 more seconds as we're still waiting on a few folks. All right. I'll start sharing these results. So here we see tracking budget, 72% of respondents feel that that's the biggest learning goal you have for attending today's session. Tied for second appears to be understanding your agency's financial reports and documents, along with salary and benefits, projections, and tracking. Really important. And then budget terminology comes in third, which ties closely with, actually writing budget narratives comes in third, tied closely with budget terminology. Great, I'll stop sharing this now. Thank you everybody for your input.
The good news is that's a lot of what we're going to be covering today.
Yep.
Okay, so here's just a real brief rundown of what we're going to cover in today. Basically, your budget is more than just numbers, different types of budgets, communicating in numbers, how to read financial reports, tips to manage your budget, and then a little bit on how to develop a program budget. So budgeting is important for a couple of reasons. It makes sure that the resources are available that you need for program services and activities. That includes planned activities, such as planned events that you have through the year, whether it is a book club for students, a family literacy event, whether you want to install a citizenship corner. Knowing how much funding you have is really required to make sure that you can achieve those goals. But understanding your budget and having a budget and keeping track of it on an ongoing basis also means that you know if you have funds available to take advantage of an unplanned opportunity. Maybe a school wants to start a family literacy group for the kindergarten parents, and they have the space and will do all of the legwork, but they need a tutor and materials. Knowing what your budget entails means that you're able to say yes or no to those unplanned partnerships and opportunities if they come up. Your budget is also used to set your priorities and goals and then can track progress. Understanding where your money is going or where it's been assigned can help you determine if an activity is cost effective and you're getting a return on investment for those funds. And it can also help you determine if a program or service should be continued, or maybe it's time to look for a different way of providing a service. If you're not getting the bang for your buck, to use kind of some slang budget terminology there. It can also be used to support other opportunities, grants, and budget augmentations. We see grants come across through email all the time related to literacy activities. You'll get them from Bev, Allison, Pro Literacy, LSTA grants. Every single one of those grant requests is going to require that you include your financial and budget information, and being able to clearly articulate what money you have, where that money is going, and then why you're applying for the grant, because you have an unfunded opportunity or service that you want to apply. That just makes your grant application stronger. It also is understanding that and keeping track of your budget makes sense when you're going to ask for more money for something. Maybe you need a budget augmentation. And if you clearly understand your budget and the terminology, it's much easier to put in writing. I need this much more money to provide this service because we have a service gap or a funding gap. So kind of staying on top of your budget. I think it's probably the least fun of everything of the work that you're doing, but it really is, can be a strong partner in enabling you to do that work. So all budgets are not created equal. Budgets set forth the operating, that's the how to spend, and the financial how to finance plan for the provision of services for an organization. Most of you fall under a bigger umbrella of an organization. So you have an operating budget and a financial budget. So your operating budget is always going to be what you're spending. Your financial budget is going to be basically covering the revenue. Your accounting people put those two things together. So understanding both sides of that is important. Knowing just what you're spending isn't the biggest part of it. So all budgets have policies and procedures around those. Budget policies and procedures are determined by legal statute. And the policies generally are the governing body of your organization, and the grantors. It's like CLLS funds are covered by the state law. So the law that made literacy funds available actually has some very specific ways on how that money can be used. And the other thing to remember is budgets are an estimate. You're not gonna, what you start out with out at the end of the year is an estimate of what you're gonna spend and what that is gonna look like. But they're always kind of adjusting and moving. Sometimes at the end of the year, hopefully you don't come in over what you were allocated. And sometimes you may come in lower than what you were allocated, but they're not chiseled in stone. Once you understand that that there is some flexibility, it actually makes it, I think, a little bit easier. Budgets are timeline driven. We'll talk about the timelines that your accounting people are tied to, and that Bev and Allison are tied to. That's why you get some of the email that you get from Allison at very specific times, because she has reports and things that she's required to do under the statute and under the budgeting policies of the state library. So she needs that information by a certain period of time. It's not a random date that is established. Those timelines don't always have a lot of flexibility within your organization or without. So here's kind of how a budget works. The planning on a budget should always be ongoing. Hopefully you're involved in your organization in contributing to the services you want to provide, how much that's going to cost, if you need materials for the next year, if you're seeing an increase in students or how to accommodate them, if you want to do more marketing, and that you have input into the budget. The person who has got the overarching control of your budget for the library is always planning, not just for literacy, but for other areas in the library. And they're taking their information up to, if it's a city or a county, to the city or county budget officer or the head of the nonprofit that does budgeting. By March, there should be a proposed budget in place that gets sent to the governing body. It could be your nonprofit board, it could be the board of supervisors, it could be the city council. This gives them the ability to start looking at it and having discussions on, okay, we don't want to spend money here because we want to spend money here. Ultimately, they're kind of deciding where the money is going to go based on the needs of services that need to be provided. That may include made budget hearings and review a second time, and those dates in March and April, depending on the process, they may be a little bit different for each organization, but it's going to occur in that timeline. By June, hopefully, the budget is approved by the governing body.
Sherilyn, I'm going to stick my nose in here and say this is a great timeline. Many local governments work on this fiscal year, which is July to June. It's the same as the state fiscal year, and we operate under some of the same conditions, although it's a little a little longer, right? In January, we get the first version of the budget, and then you go back and hack through it, and then you got to get proposals in, and then in May there is what's called the May revise. So the state operates on the same principle by and large, but for the federal government doesn't, right? Their fiscal year is October to September. Some of you may work for or with nonprofits or even other districts that have a different fiscal year. So this is a great outline of a typical fiscal year. And then, as Allison points out, there's the calendar year, which is how maybe you consider a lot of data. And there may be lots of other fiscal years out there. I want to point it out in part because one of the things that we've recently been talking about and opened up to literacy program are applications to participate in funding in support of the Parks Pass program, the state Parks Pass program. And for whatever reason, it's not operating on the typical state fiscal year. So its year is a little bit off. And sometimes you have to figure that out and accommodate the spending, and it may spread over 2 fiscal years, and you've got to be really careful about that. And we'll be talking about that a little later in the presentation. Thanks,
Yep.
Sherilyn.
So July fiscal year begins for most of you, but like Bev said, it is kind of dependent on a couple of other things. By December, if you have a July start of your fiscal year, many times that's when your mid-year modifications can be requested, or augmentations could go in. May encumbrance requests and modifications can also go in. June for your financial people, or at the end of whatever the fiscal year is, we'll refer to June for this piece of it. Your final purchase orders need to be submitted. Your final purchases need to be completed, because anything that is not spent or encumbered by the end of June 30th, and that's why Allison's always asking you to make sure if you need to encumber your money, because you need to state what that is being used for. And that needs to not just go to her, but it needs to go through your financial people also. Anything that's not expended by June 30th will fall into the next fiscal year. So you want to make sure that you've planned and accounted for that. July, the final bills are submitted generally, and then your accounting people or budget people will close the books for the fiscal year. And the reason it's important to know that there is a timeline on that, you'll see your budget people will be a little bit crazy between June and August. That's because they're trying to wrap up one end and they're trying to start another year, and they're trying to track those expenses to make sure that anything that it comes at the end of a fiscal year isn't paid for out of the other year. And that's where your budget people will love you if you kind of don't leave things to the last minute when it gets to those months, and that you get all of your requests or questions into them.
Sherilyn, let me just add something on there. If you can go back to this slide.
Yep.
I think this is really important for people to remember, because with the timelines, there is an opportunity to encumber your CLLS funds from what would be the previous fiscal year into the next 6 months. And that's fine. But what you have to make sure you do is let the people who handle your money know that you're rolling that money over. Some of us have faced this challenge, right? Where at the end of the fiscal year, you might have thought there was money left in your account, but it suddenly becomes part of the general fund, or it's suddenly taken for some other purpose. So you have a lot of responsibilities for that money, and having that conversation with a supervisor, having that conversation with a financial person in advance is going to save you a lot of heartbreak, right? We don't want any of you to fall in the trap that many of us have fallen into, which is we thought we had money, and then suddenly what happened to it in the accounting? So please remember that your organization, usually your local government, closes things out at the fiscal year, and they don't know that you intended to spend that money in August and September or through December. You've got to tell them, and you've got to be really explicit about how much money it is and when you're going to spend it. So thanks, Sherilyn, for letting me stick in there. So there are some special budget concerns that some of you are familiar with. Your library jurisdiction may be funded by a special tax, or what's called a millage, or a levy, and those funds have certain restrictions, right? So always be aware, have that conversation. Sometimes they're funds you can spend freely for literacy as matching funds, but sometimes they aren't. Sometimes they're there for particular reasons. The same thing's true for restricted funds, which may be given as a gift or a grant. You can't just spend somebody else's grant money or some other gift. If there's a restriction on a fund, you should know it, but you should also make it clear to your financial people and how long that restriction lasts. Grants, the same thing, right? Grant funds must be spent on grant purposes. Every grant you get will require the same kind of accounting that we ask for you in CLLS. So many of you have had outside grants. You know those conditions. You also know that those grants may run on a different fiscal year. So I'm going to say this piece of advice, and we're going to say it repeatedly. It's always good to keep your own tracking records too, to duplicate, to make sure you have backup. Another thing is capital budgets. So typically governments have funds that are restricted for capital improvement projects. This is stuff like work in building. Like a capital project is something that's fixed to the building. That's the easiest way to explain it. It's not programming. It's not services. It's related to structures essentially. Capital budgets are different, and you just want to be aware of that. It's not the same as your operating expenses. And finally, some of you I know have trust accounts, have funding that was given for a particular purpose, restricted for a particular purpose, or your friends and foundation holds money for literacy. Make sure that you're always renewing those relationships. Make sure that is very clearly accounted for in those organizations' financial statements, so that a new person coming in, and we have so much turnover in libraries and turnover in literacy programs, doesn't either forget that money exists or use it for another purpose and say, oh, look, the Friends of the Library have $10,000 and assume that's unrestricted, when in fact, that's the money that you raised as a fundraiser. The Friends are holding it for you until when you want to spend it in whatever fiscal year, right? Maybe you've got plans for that. Always try to make sure that people know what funds are intended for, and you always check up, because error is mostly human, and people in positions of financial accounting and literacy coordination and library administration change. Don't assume that the institutional memory is a given. You've got to help create that. So thanks for letting me say these things.
And just as a note to add to what Bev said, your trust accounts are generally automatically rolling. So there's money always coming in and out of those, and there's like a constant tracking of that. They generally don't start on a fiscal year and end on a fiscal year. That money generally rolls over automatically if it's a trust account. If you have those, you're going to want to check with your people, but that's generally the case. And
all right, so a big part of funding, as I think both Sherilyn and Bev have already touched on, is the allowable expenses. And for CLLS, we have a pretty extensive but not exhaustive allowable and unallowable expenses document that is a great place to turn to check what types of expenses are allowable using CLLS funds according to both the CLLS law and other guidelines that have been created. But one thing to remember is always make sure you have the most up-to-date version, because allowable expenses are not always the same from year to year. And for example, in the 2022-2023 fiscal year for CLLS, a change has been made to what can count as a local match. Prior to this, unallowable CLLS expenses were able to you to be able to use your local match to make those purchases. But now, according to the new allowable and unallowable expenses guidelines, local match must align with allowable and unallowable expenses for CLLS. And so so it's important to know these changes and find and have the most up-to-date version of the allowable and unallowable expenses guidelines. And all of these can be found on libraryliteracy.org, and I'll drop some into the chat. And a part of the governing portion of this is the state law. As read here, a local library shall ensure that funds received pursuant to this chapter are exclusively used for expenses resulting from providing English language and literacy services, and shall ensure that at least 90% of the funds received for the program are expended on direct services and related materials. And you may have heard from either me or Bev about direct what counts as a direct service and would fall under that 90% or more, or what may fall in the 10% or less of indirect costs. And part of what we're trying to keep, what we want to make sure is being spent appropriately, is to align with this law that governs CLLS.
A typical example of something we don't consider a direct service is the person who handles payroll for your library. We understand that's administrative time, paying your paycheck, but that's an indirect cost. The same thing, I think of indirect costs as the cost of doing business. In general, your literacy program doesn't get its own electric bill, right? For the lights that you run. So that cost of doing business is indirect. Direct costs are those that serve your literacy program and that serve the goal of instruction and working with adult learners.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some budget terms. Then we're going to talk about your financial people, and then we're going to actually look at some spreadsheets and kind of try and wrap in all of the things that we've hit on these earlier slides into that so that you know what you're looking at. Revenue versus expenditures. Your revenue is your general fund monies, your grants, your tax revenue, your donations. That's going to come in and it is going to show in one place on your budgeting spreadsheet, and your financial people keep track of that. A good idea is to always check is when the check comes in from the state, it comes in two parts of the money. Always double check that revenue has come in and has been deposited to the right place. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Your expenditures are anything that is going out: supplies, salaries, operating costs, indirect costs. And so once you know that revenue is anything coming into you, and it can be in multiple formats, and your expenditures is anything that is going out, and that can also be in multiple formats. Make friends with your financial people, and understand who is responsible for budgeting in your agency, because that will enable you to ask the questions that you need to ask and get the reports that you need to do. And those are the things that are going to enable you to track your budget successfully. You may not be responsible for doing any of the back end stuff with actually paying the bills or developing the budget completely, just offering input, but knowing who's doing that in your organization is key to being able to get the information you need to ensure that you are tracking your budget expenses. And that was one of the things that everybody was most interested in tracking your budget. And you can't just do it on your own. It's not one of those things that you can do easily by yourself. Make friends with your organization's financial people. Stop in, say hi, introduce yourself. They don't often get a lot of interaction because they're very accountant-y. And that's good because they're generally detail oriented and they're doing work that is very prescribed and time consuming, but social interaction is important to all of us. Don't be afraid to ask for help, clarification, and ask twice if you need to. They're generally really, really helpful. And the reason I'm saying ask twice if you need to is make sure the terminology that they are using may be slightly different than what you're asking for. So if you don't think, or they're unsure of what you think that they are getting, because they will use the terminology in whatever accounting software or spreadsheets they are using, ask twice to make sure that you understand what's coming in, what's going out, what's the cost, what the different funds are. And they will ask that question. Your fiscal people are not grant people. You absolutely need to give them the language related to those funds that are coming in, and the language related to allowable and unallowable expenses. Ideally, you would give that to them every year, so that they have it. Definitely give it to anybody if you're changing the information. I know oftentimes it goes to the department head, but in some organizations, the department head may be the signee on something, but they're not doing the actual financial pieces of the mechanics of that. Providing them that information is an amazing way to make sure that your grant funds are being expended, that they're not being pulled to maybe be used for something that they shouldn't be. And it's a really good double check and checks and balance to make sure that you are following the instructions of the grant. And that is any grant, not just your CLLS grant.
And I'm going to add something, Sherilyn, here, which is in some places, and it depends on the size, the complexity, and the nature of your library system and administration, you may get the message that you shouldn't be asking for this information, or you shouldn't be asking directly for this information, and that's fine. Follow the guidance provided by the chain of command by your supervisor, but write your questions down and document them and document the answers, because that's really going to help you. If you're in a place where you just don't have access to that, you can always explain to your supervisor why it's important and why you're a little bit different than other people who work in the library. But if you have to go through a different process, that's fine. I just suggest writing your questions down and documenting your questions and the responses that you get. So if somebody gives you a verbal response, write it down and repeat it back to make sure you've understood it. So you have the documentation. I think that's a really important thing for everyone to know, to be brave. I mean, a lot of dealing with financial stuff is being brave. And one of the things I recommend, I mean, library budgets are public documents. You don't need to know the whole library's budget, but you can look at what's presented to your city council or your board of supervisors, for example, and you might learn something really interesting. Because, for example, and you guys know, what's the biggest cost in a library budget? You guys might know because you have some idea. But what is the biggest chunk of the library's budget? Always its salaries, right? That is where your tax money is going. Super important for you to know. You have a lot of interaction with the public. I see there's a lot of stuff in chat, so I'm going to be quiet. We'll come back and address it. But Sherilyn, thanks for letting me.
So that was a perfect segue in here. Your budget is public. That is public information. Your library's budget is public information. If you're getting any kind of government funding, that is public information. Drilling down into those budget numbers is public information. You are not asking for anything that you are not allowed to have. Like Bev said, you want to make sure that you're following the right process and that you're asking and that you're documenting and all of those things. But this is public information. Anybody can request this information. So here's the reports that you're most likely going to want to ask for. You're going to want to ask for the annual budget for literacy. And this may be broken down into one budget code, or it may be broken down into adult literacy, family literacy, ESL services. Everybody does a little bit differently. Larger organizations probably are more likely to have it broken down. Smaller organizations may have it all included in one place and track it differently there. But there is an annual budget that is available from your financial people. It'll show you what the budget was probably for the previous year, what the proposed budget is going forward, and then there's usually columns in there for actual, and I think I have an example of that later, so we'll cover those. You can ask for monthly expenditure reports. That will come two different ways. You can ask for a monthly expenditure report that just shows what has been expended in a line item without going into the detail. So if you say, can you give me a monthly expenditure report by line item? It'll show everything that you spent that month in office supplies. It won't show the vendors, but that it will show everything that was attributed to office supplies. And it can be tracked monthly. You want to ask for salary projections and of what that is going to be. Those are also public information. It doesn't have to be provided to you by name. It can be provided different ways, but it will help you fill out that salary information. Final closing budget report. Usually that's not available until August, but it comes out, it shows what your proposed budget or approved budget was, shows you how much money was expended for a particular line item, and everything else. The other thing I didn't include in here, and they can be tedious, but for some of you, you're going to want to request them, is a monthly detail report that shows every single invoice that was paid and the vendor that it was paid to, typically by line item. These are easy to generate reports generally for most organizations. They're not hard. Find out if you can get, if you are even a mid-size or a small organization, they are probably, the financial person is probably already sending these out to a mailing list every month as an attachment. Find out if you can get on that list.
I'm going to add, Sherilyn, that the budget categories that we use for CLLS in the grant application are actually different than the budget categories we use in any other grant application for the state library. Quite different than the budget categories that your government, your financial governing institution uses. So you guys know from the CLLS application reports, we ask for salary and benefits, we ask for contract staff, we ask for operations, we ask for library literacy materials, supply. Did I get this right? Supplies, and then items over, items over $5,000, equipment, small equipment, and equipment over $5,000, and then also indirect. Your city probably isn't set up that way, so you should keep in mind, right, when you're keeping your own spreadsheet, track what's going on in the categories that are used by your government, but also track what's going on in the categories you're going to use to report back to us. In many cases, it's very simple to translate those things over, but it may be really different. And so it's always a good idea to track individual purchases, invoices, and that kind of stuff, because not all projects align. And those of you who have held LSTA grants or other grants know that the budget categories for those grants are different, and the budget categories for your governing institution are going to be different. So be wise, know what components go into each category.
Okay, so here's reading your budget. Every budget has a name, and it has a number. It will either be something called a fund code, which is actually showing the income, or an object code, which is actually showing an expense. Then under the object codes, there will be a line item name or a sub object code. And we're going to actually look at a spreadsheet in just a minute, a sub object code that defines specifically what that expense is. One of the things that your organization probably has, and I highly recommend that you get it off of the website, is a chart of accounts. And the chart of accounts generally lists all of the accounts for your organization, and for you, it will show what the fund codes are for those. They can be thick, but understanding what those numbers are can be helpful down the road. It will show the object code assigned to a specific expense, and then it will have a sub-object code, and we'll talk about that in this next spreadsheet. So can you guys see this? Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So up here at the top, and I can't see it because I wonder if I can close this. Up here at the top, it shows what I can look at on my thing. It shows the object code. So the object code for the literacy program grant for this organization is 6309. Now, I happen to know that this organization also has a fund object code for their family literacy program and for their ESL program. Then there's a description, and it will tell you right across the top, this is for the literacy program. Then the columns, it'll tell you the budget. That's generally the approved budget that's been input after it's been approved by the governing agency. And then this adjustments column is typically used if you've requested a budget modification, or if more money has been spent in one area and they need to move funds from another area. That's what the adjustments column is for. The month actual, this report you can request. This is the one that you can request monthly. It'll tell you how much has been spent monthly in the year that you've gotten it. So this one was probably spent in early in the fiscal year. So this may be a April or a August or September report. Then year-to-date column will show you the total amount completely spent in all of those, everything that's been contributed to that money. And then it will show you what the balance of funds that is available, and then the percentage that is left. The reason that this is important is that you can look at this, and if you know you have an August report and your year-to-date for August for salaries is only $60,000 that month, and you know that that's about your annual cost for salaries, you know that you still have money left. So you can, it enables you to track those expenses. By the time it gets to the end of June, the year-to-date actual amount should be almost the entire amount that is budgeted for salary and expenses. This one breaks down salaries, wages, regular, all of the things that are accrued. And this is generally for everything that is going to come to that fund. Bev's going to talk about salaries in just a minute. There's also a form that breaks down salaries. It's called a salary projection sheet. You can typically request it by position, not by name. And that what is projected there may be slightly off than this amount that's budgeted actually for salaries, but they should match pretty easily. And that can be used in Allison's salary spreadsheet to help you do that initial budget. But remember, your budget is only an estimate. If you look down here at services and supplies, so the sub-object code for this is the 2000 series. And that's the object code underneath each of these. So are the items that Bev is talking about. All of these are the amounts that have been budgeted and set up by your financial people. And understanding this, you may know that you have something coming up that is going to cost a lot of money. And I don't have services on here or so these are usually going to be broken down into services and supplies. Like Bev said, know what these are. You will have communication, operating expenses. Most of these may be, operating expenses that are actually charged to the operation of that thing. Under here, I didn't put the second page in, but library materials, small tools and equipment, technology or laptops. There's usually a line item for each of those. If you know which one of those, there will be multiple of these that break down into the simpler line items that are in your CLLS budget. And
So it's everyone, are your heads spinning yet? The simple, if you've ever looked at a nonprofit financial statement, you'll see the same things. There are codes or classifications under which things are sorted. So all of the things under 1,000, all of those specific codes, those are all the things included in salary, including lots of things we don't necessarily think about. It's totally fascinating to me. I'm sitting here thinking, oh, that's how much they pay for insurance, for vision insurance, but but not everyone I understand is fascinated by these numbers. So, and other things like, I don't know a single literacy program that gets a uniform allowance, right?
Nope.
So there's a lot of categories that may not be relevant to you, or actually may not be relevant to CLLS, but it's kind of the cost of doing business. So you have to be really careful looking at this stuff, but this is the raw data, the raw material.
And the reason that those blank things are in there is because it just spits out a report with all of the available line items. And all of those line items are available in that chart of accounts that is available on your organization's webpage or from your financial planner or budget people. And it's always good just to take a look at it because I think it gives a better understanding. So let me move this. Okay, so this is at the bottom of that spreadsheet. So in that spreadsheet, what I showed you was the first page. There's 2 other pages after that that include expenses for library materials, and it's all broken down. At the end of that spreadsheet, it's completely counterintuitive as to how it is reported, because you would think, oh, this is all of the money that we've spent and that we've expended, and this should be what the amount is. Generally, what you will find in software, financial software that is automated, the spreadsheet is going to spit something out that will have all of the information in there, but it is also going to include the information of where the money is coming from and how much money there is in there. So if you look at this, because this particular literacy program gets a grant, and then the money for the rest of the fund comes from the general fund. It is not the general fund money is not included on here. But if you look at this 9902, this is the fund balance. It's not put in there because the financial people can always adjust that. The revenue, this number up here actually reflects the first check that this organization gets from CLLS. The reason the second check isn't in there is because you don't always know what it's going to be, and they don't do estimates on this piece of it. The total expense under the budget for this is $803,000, and that's what's budgeted. You can see what it ultimately ended up being for this amount is at this month. And now that I'm looking at it, I'm thinking this is probably May. So far, they've spent $730,000. And then you can see, I'm pointing at my screen. That's not overly helpful to you guys. I just realized. So the grand total of the expense is going to be here. What this number is looking at is now it's figuring in, and I didn't include it in here. This budget actually includes an indirect line item cost. And that would be anything that is not a cost of doing operations, and that is usually put across. And indirect costs, like Bev said, would be the cost of the accounting services, the cost of the building taxes or whatever that is. It's not a direct operational cost. It is indirect. Everybody has to pay it. No matter what department there is. And that's where that difference comes in here. But you can see our columns are here. Here's where some adjustments have been made to the amount of total expense. They took a little bit of money away, and that's because they knew they weren't going to have postage or something actual or whatever. This 95,000 is how much was actually spent that month for all of the services. And year to date, they've spent $756,000. You can see here, this encumbrance is actually tied to the amount that's here. So what happened here is they knew they weren't going to spend all of the money in a particular line item, and they requested an encumbrance. So to say, okay, we're not going to spend this by June, but we absolutely have the order coming. It's just not going to be here until July, and it needs to be paid. This is why asking for an encumbrance, not just from Bev and Allison, is so important. It has to be reflected in your spreadsheets with your financial people. And often, even if you don't know exactly what to request or how to request it, sending them an email and saying, I'm not going to spend all of this money, I'm going to spend it in the next year, that preserves that money into running over so that it actually shows up and they know that it transfers, because you do not want to lose your money.
And it makes sure that you have a written record.
Yes.
Emails are great.
Yep. Make sure it shows up. And that's why you don't have to fully understand these, although they can be super fascinating, but you need to at least know when you're looking at it, what it is. Okay. So this spreadsheet at the end of the year can actually be cut down into, if you want to do it, and this is a really simple, easy way of doing it, is you can take all of those columns out. When you get that last spreadsheet of the year and you know that everything's been paid out, you can ask for a final spreadsheet and take out all of those extra columns so that literally all you have is the budget and the year-to-date annual of what the actual expenses were. This, once you've done that and you end up with something like this, it makes it really easy to do your final report for CLLS, because you can say, okay, for salaries and wages, I budgeted $700,000 and we actually spent $691. That initial budget can actually be used in your original application for your CLLS funds. And then it can all be tied together. And then at the end of it, now you know where your adjustments are. Ideally, if you are really into it, all of these numbers will match up in your CLLS application. And then when you do your final budget with Allison, reports, it'll all tie together. So like for this, the 691,824 in salaries, you want to account for which part of that was from your grant and which part of it was from Adult Literacy Services local. Salaries will break down a little bit different way, but the software, the services and supplies. So I took out all the blank lines in here. So you can see that in this budget, communication telephone system, communication voicemail, household expense, which is janitorial, liability expense, maintenance and building improvement here. All of those things are all part of duplicating services, are all operating expenses. Managed print costs, that's how many copies they've made, are all part of operating costs. Library materials does correspond directly to what's in the CLLS thing. Utilities, water, meals, refreshments, these are actuals that could be included in operating costs, and that's how this organization tracks them. So the bulk of your line items would come out of services and supply, and like every budget might be a little bit different. Other professional services in this is contractors for this organization. So all of the contractor support is paid for out of here. So it becomes really easy to say, okay, the contractors cost $12,487. That directly translates to your CLLS report. Down here, that indirect costs is where this is captured right here. It might be an interfund service, professional postage. It just depends, and your financial people can answer those questions. But when you get rid of all of the extraneous extra lines and you have this final report, you can see exactly what you spent and exactly what was budgeted, and it can make it really easy just to translate those numbers right into your final budget report when that Allison sends. And if you're not using her templates that she's sending you and her spreadsheets, you are missing out because they really do help those numbers come out correctly.
I'm going to say on that spreadsheet, your institution's tracking may look very different. And if you have any question about a category, ask Allison and me, because there are some things that we would consider indirect that may be in there. I mean, that was a nice example, because when you added up all of those things, they actually came out to less than 10% of the rest of the budget, which is a nice thing. But library materials were in there, and we have a separate category for library literacy materials. You might have to pull that out. So you really look at those very carefully, and lots of places don't calculate all those things. They don't give you a separate project code for literacy. So how do you deal with that? You deal with it by putting it in indirect, and we are happy to answer those questions. What you just saw was a super detailed example. As somebody who does really, really detailed budgeting, but you may not see that reflected for your organization, or your organization may account for things that we might not consider being spent on direct services. So always ask the questions.
And that's why it's always important to make sure that what you're getting is related to the fund code that is being expended, like I said, and this is very detailed. So if I requested the library's budget, that line item for library materials for this particular organization would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. But because at the top it says specifically literacy, we know that it's broken down. But ask those questions. That's why you want to make friends with your financial people. And that's why you want to email Bev and Allison.
Yeah, you may not see all that complicated detail. I want to say something about salaries and benefits, because every year Allison and I review your applications and reports, and we think, gee, is this really a fair accounting of what was spent? So you may know that library assistant in your program is being paid $18 an hour, and that's what you use to calculate the salary and benefits line. Well, not so easy. Right. So you can actually use the exact accounting, and Sherilyn gave you a great example where it was broken down, like how much is spent on dental insurance and how much is spent on vision experience, and whatever your city is contributing, your city's portion of your FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare, right? But you may not have that. So it's okay to use a percentage basis. The term that I was taught that is used, and that Allison and I used, is the burden cost. So you can ask your financial people, what is the burden cost for an hourly employee? Or is there a percentage we add? So for that $18 an hour employee, it actually costs your city or your library more than $18 an hour, because they are paying some contributions, even though that person isn't getting benefits probably. Right? They're working 10 hours a week or whatever they're working for $18 an hour. There is still some extra cost, and that's the burden cost. It might be 10% more. It might be ask what it is. You can do the same thing for a full-time person. And that is, you can just say, and what's the burden cost for a full-time employee in this sector in my city? I know that there were certain classifications. So that police and firefighters actually had a higher burden cost. And they might tell you 39%. It used to be in federal grants, when you were calculating a budget, you were allowed 20% for benefits. So the burden rate was 20%, 120% of someone's salary, right? Now they've recently raised it. I think it may be 30%. But in the real world, in some of your libraries, it may be quite a bit higher, right? There are places in California, and particularly if you work in a unionized or collectively bargained workplace, where the benefit rate may approach 50%, right? There's some hover around there. I don't know. I'm not your library director, but you can ask that question. What's the burden rate? So you probably know how much you make per hour, or your salary rate for yourself. And you should be able to find that out for the people you supervise as well. This is all public information if you're a public employee. I know we're very shy about asking about what people make. Most of us has been raised that that's not an appropriate conversation to have. But in fact, when you're a public employee, that is available for everyone. But if they say the burden rate is this percentage, that's fine. Take someone's hourly rate or their salary and then multiply it with the appropriate percentage. The one thing we've noticed increasingly is that as we look at people's salaries, that their burden rate appears to be incredibly high compared to their pay rate. And we have noticed that's because in some places, governments are included what are called unfunded pension liabilities. So they're going to have to pay out in CalPERS a lot more than they collect. Right? And they're doing some budget stuff to make up for that. We cannot allow unfunded pension liabilities as a benefit for you. So your existing pension liability, what it is for this year, you know, the current thing that you're paying into and your government's paying into, that's fine. But if there is something on there from past years, that's an unfunded liability, or if your city or jurisdiction has to pay, and this does exist in some places, you have to pay a premium before you hire someone new. You can't create a new position without paying a chunk of money for unfunded pension liabilities. That's fine, that's their policy, but geez, please know that state funds cannot be used, it cannot be spent on unfunded pension liabilities. And because the allowable expenses in the accounting now says that anything in your matching column has to also be allowable, you can't put it in your matching column either. So this is something we've only noticed recently. It has accounted for great disparities, and we are very careful about this because one of the factors in the formula that calculates your next year's award is how much local contribution you have. So we have to make sure that the local contribution is legitimate and allowable under our standards. We know it's real money that your city or government has to pay, but we can't count it in our accounting. So I know that is a little bit complicated, and sometimes we may go in and look up, you know, if you've never looked at it, there actually is a law in California about public employees salaries being visible. There's a website called Transparent California, and depending on how much information your government provides, there may be a little information, there may be a lot of information, it may be up to date, it may be out of date, but there often is information there, and we can see whether there's sometimes see whether there is unfunded pension liabilities. So be careful about that. I realize that you probably walked into this 65 minutes ago not thinking about unfunded pension liabilities, and it is not something I think about a lot, but please be aware that we understand that benefits are super expensive, and there's just one element of that expense that we don't allow. Most people don't claim it. It's not buried in most people's salaries numbers, but for a few of you it is, and it would be wise to know. Thanks, Caroline.
Great. So as we kind of touched on already, another budget term is allowable expenses. And so organizations and grants may have limitations on what you could spend funds on. And so this is true for both like CLLS as a grant program, but other grant programs, and then even within your organization. And I think a few slides ago, Bev touched on a few different types of like restrictive budgets that would dictate what expenses are allowable and unallowable for that particular funding stream. So these are important things to know. And for CLLS, if you're ever unsure, you can always reach out to Bev Rai, because as I mentioned before, the allowable and unallowable expenses are a document is extensive but not exhaustive, and something is bound to come up occasionally in terms of like what may be considered an allowable expense, and you can always check in just to make sure. And so some additional tips on managing your budget. You may have seen this come through, but we do have a few CLLS budget and salary and benefits spreadsheets that help keep track of salary and benefits and the associated percentage of FTE for a particular program. I don't think the CLLS budget's up on the webpage at the moment, but I could put that on libraryliteracy.org. But the salary, staff salary chart spreadsheet is available on the funding applications and reports webpage. And I could drop that into the chat after my section here. And I think Bev and Sherilyn have both mentioned keeping your own spreadsheet for backup. This is a really important tool to have and refer to. It's great for cross-checking to make sure expenses that have come through are like align with what you know has been spent, because you never know. Some days could be coded improperly by accident, or sometimes things come up closer to the end of the fiscal year where funds might be moved, because as Sherilyn mentioned, our financial people are not always grant people, and they might see money there, and that's just money to spend to them, even though it's been aligned for a particular purpose for us. So being able to track that your own spending is always a great backup to have when you're cross-checking and making sure everything is aligning with what you've said you were going to spend and how you're going to spend it. And then writing budget narratives. I know this was pretty high on our initial poll. So when you're for budget narratives, having your own spreadsheet is also great because as you can see in Sherilyn's example, you may not always, it may not always explicitly say what that expense is. So having your own spreadsheet is great for keeping track of expenses in like terms that make sense for you. And then that will inevitably help when you're completing final reports or mid-year reports to develop your budget narratives, so that when you're reporting how those expenses were spent, you're able to kind of provide a pretty detailed overview for each line item and how each of those line items were spent. So for operations, $1,000 for mileage, maybe another $500 for printing costs, maybe an additional $500 for one-time performers. And so because you have your own spreadsheet, you'd be able to use that as a way to help itemize those expenses for a more detailed budget narrative breakdown in the different reports that you have for CLLS. And I can drop an example into the chat also. And finally, requesting a budget modification. So for CLLS, you have up until May 31st of the program year for the current program year's funding to request a budget modification. And so the budget modifications for CLLS funds is due May 31st, 2023. For your 2022-2023 funding. And you can submit a budget change request before then as well, if you know that you are going to have to move money around from one line item to another. If you're spending differently than you had anticipated, but within the same line item, you don't have to submit a budget modification. You also don't have to submit a budget modification for any changes in your local expenses. Only for CLLS awards funding that is being spent differently from the way you indicated on your approved budget on file, and where funding is being moved or intended to be moved from one budget item to another. And so if you need to request a budget modification, reach out to me and I'll send you our budget modification form, and I can even help put that together. And I just like cross-check it, make sure that it's lining up with what I can see, so that everybody's records line up and match. And I think that's it. I don't know if Bev, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I do want to say a couple things. And one is we do really carefully check these reports, as most of you know. And so, Allison, often it's on your behalf. We look at salaries, for example, and we say, could it really be possible that this program is only saying that they're paying this person $6.50 an hour? Because that's not legal in California. And so we'll go back to you and we'll ask those questions. We also ask questions about operating expenses. And sometimes it turns out, oh, well, yeah, actually people who did the budget, they lumped all our literacy materials, all our books and stuff in operating expenses. We're like, no, we want that pulled out because there's a reason we want to report that. That's very helpful data for us to have to report to our stakeholders. So you guys know we do go back to you with lots of questions about this, and we do pay attention to it in some detail. I do want to say this thing about keeping a backup record. It never crossed my mind. And then many years ago, I was sitting at some literacy event next to a wonderful literacy coordinator who's now retired. And she said, oh yeah, I always keep a second set of books. And it was like a light bulb went off in my head. I thought that never would have crossed my mind. Did I do it perfectly? No. I just kept a spreadsheet and I tried to put everything in there. Did I ever do it 100% accurately? No. Did it save my bacon when I came to fill out that report? Every single year, right? So just keeping a spreadsheet, making yourself an Excel sheet, according to the CLLS categories, maybe moving things around, because we know that your government isn't going to have the same codes, the same classifications, the same categories as we ask for in CLLS, and being able to track things backwards. Like it has happened to me in many places and times where someone said, they say like, where's the money for literacy? And they're like, what was the check? And I'll say, well, it was $44,000. And they say, oh, we put it in this other account, right? So you really want to keep track of these things. And I am not going to tell tales on who this was, but someone you know well and love told me a story about working in an institution where she was trying to track her own budget and was told by the financial person or whoever she was talking to in the administration said, oh, we just put all of grants into one fund. And then when we get an invoice, we just pay it down, and we get, your salary, we would just pay it down. And that the institution had multiple grants. And she said, no, that's not acceptable. She said she got in so much trouble, but that's what allowed her to do the accounting for her own program. So please make sure, we're not saying that everybody has to have perfect systems and that everyone's systems look the same, but there are ways that you can check, and it really helps you. It will help you at the end of the year. We know that filling out those budget documents and calculating budgets is probably no one's favorite task, but it's very, very important to keep an eye on it among the many other things that you do. So with that said, I think, Allison, did you just put something there in chat? Right.
Yes, I just dropped a sample budget narrative that we like to see when we're looking through the final reports. So this one breaks down, it's doing a few things. It's breaking down expenses for the operations line item for adult literacy and family literacy for this program. And it's also breaking down the actual expenses for like the lumped together costs. So for example, if you turn to the chat, it says ALS, adult literacy services, purchase office supplies and memberships, Dropbox, Library World, TDS copies and more, $1,542. Office equipment maintenance, $555, and then family literacy purchase subscription for Ready Rosie, $3,000. And so not everybody might have this like level of detail available to you, which is okay. But if you do, it's really great to see a breakdown, because then we're able to check these costs, cross-check them, make sure they're allowable, and they can be reported on this report. But a level of detail is really great to see, and it might help your future self after you submit the report, because we might ask you, hey, we need to see a little more detail on like what these operations costs were. And that's actually one of the sections we do look at closely, because there could be so many things that fall into it. And some of our organizations consider things that CLLS thinks of as indirect as operations costs. So those we kind of are checking that line pretty closely.
Yeah, and I would say that there is a huge variance in those operation costs, and there are things we look at the low end and the high end. One thing, so for the operations narrative, one thing that would not be a very acceptable narrative would be in that narrative box where it says, this covers operations, right? So having a more detailed breakdown is very helpful. So don't be afraid to wow us with detail. We love detail. General statements are harder. So why don't we stop recording and then ask these questions? What would you like to learn more about? Actually, we'll ask these questions. Let's just put in so it's in the recording, the next two slides that have the links to resources. And then we'll come back and open up everybody's camera and ask what else they'd like to learn. So here are some resources, but not all of them at libraryliteracy.org. And the links will be, when we put this in Call Academy, we'll make them separate links, and we'll also have the slides available so you can link. And then the next set, what's a few things that are already in Call Academy, which has library training of all sorts. You may know more about finances than some public library directors. Then finally, some great stuff about from EdNet, from Pro Literacy. A lot of the organizations Pro Literacy deals with are nonprofits, and that's a whole nother budgeting set of lessons that we're not necessarily experts on, but there's a lot to learn in these education modules.